U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening 100% tariffs on Canadian goods.
Now, the American President Donald Trump has issued a pretty stark warning to Canada, threatening a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods.
If you were watching global markets this week and felt a strange tension in the air, there was a reason for it. Because something massive shifted between Washington and Ottawa, and most people still do not understand how deep it runs. This was not another loud political spat or a temporary trade dispute that fades after a few headlines. This was a coordinated economic strike, followed by a calculated counterpunch that caught the White House completely off guard. By the end of it, alliances had moved, money had rerouted, and power had quietly changed hands. Stay with this, because what unfolded here will shape how the world does business for years. If you look at what happened between Washington and Ottawa overnight, it does not resemble negotiation or compromise. It looks like economic warfare carried out with tariffs, executive orders, and market leverage instead of missiles or troops. For decades, the United States and Canada operated as the most tightly integrated economy on Earth, two countries functioning like a single machine, efficient, quiet, and deeply interconnected across manufacturing, energy, agriculture, finance, and technology. That machine now sits under real strain. Donald Trump signed an executive order invoking emergency economic powers against Canada, branding America's closest neighbor a national security threat, a move that stunned diplomats and economists alike, given that Canada fought alongside the United States in every major conflict since World War I, opened its airports to stranded Americans after 9/11, and shares the most complex supply chain relationship in global commerce. The response from Mark Carney did not involve public outrage or frantic calls to Washington. There was no pleading, no dramatic television address. Instead, Carney reached for a pen and in less than 12 hours signed a series of agreements that sent shockwaves through Wall Street, European exchanges, and energy markets, with ripples already moving straight into household budgets. Trump erupted online, Congress scrambled behind closed doors, and much of the media missed the real story because what Carney executed was not a protest. It was a structural realignment that could reshape the global economy for a generation. To understand how it reached this point, rewind the clock a bit. After the initial tariff standoff, when Carney publicly rejected Trump's ultimatum, everyone expected fireworks. News crews parked themselves outside Canadian diplomatic buildings. Reporters refreshed Truth Social every half minute. Commentators waited for the next explosion. Instead, Ottawa went silent for 3 full days. No press briefings, no leaks, no statements beyond a single line from the Prime Minister's office saying Canada was evaluating all available options. In Washington, that silence was misread as weakness. Fox News ran a banner claiming Canada had folded. Trump posted a late-night victory message, calling Carney a failed banker who had learned his lesson. Senior White House officials quietly told reporters that Canada had reached out to negotiate. That never happened. Canada was not calling anyone. Canada was building something. At 6 a.m. Eastern yesterday morning, before markets opened and before Trump started his day, Carney stepped in front of cameras, not in Ottawa, but in Brussels, standing beside leaders from the European Commission, while Japan's Prime Minister appeared on a live feed behind them. Then Carney made 3 announcements, delivered back-to-back, each one landing harder than the last. First came the Canada-EU Emergency Economic Partnership. This was not a symbolic gesture or a vague promise of cooperation. It was a full emergency framework with fast-tracked regulatory alignment, mutual recognition of standards, and preferential market access. The groundwork had already been laid quietly over months. While Trump focused on tariffs and social media posts, Carney had been coordinating encrypted calls with Brussels in the early hours of the morning. The deal effectively handed Canadian manufacturers, farmers, and energy producers a fast lane into European markets. If the United States wanted to shut its doors, Europe had opened its own. Markets reacted immediately. Within 90 minutes, currency pairs moved more than they had in half a year. European energy stocks jumped. Canadian oil sands companies that had been hammered by tariff fears surged nearly 9% before lunch. Money moved faster than politicians could process what had happened. Then came announcement number 2, the Pacific Corridor Energy Accord. And this is where Washington started to panic. Canada revealed a fast-tracked agreement with Japan and South Korea to redirect liquefied natural gas and heavy crude exports across the Pacific, paired with accelerated pipeline and port construction on British Columbia's coast. Carney invoked national economic security powers to bypass environmental reviews that had delayed these projects for years. The former head of the Bank of England, the same man who once lectured global forums about climate finance, had cleared the regulatory path for pipelines, not out of ideological shift, but because survival outweighed symbolism. The message was blunt. Canada would no longer exist as a captive supplier. The era of the United States serving as Canada's primary energy customer was ending, and the timeline was not decades away. It was 18 months. This terrified Washington for a very specific reason. The entire U.S. refining system across the Midwest and Gulf Coast is built around Canadian heavy crude. Those refineries were engineered for it. Switching suppliers is not simple. Retrofitting facilities to handle lighter Middle Eastern crude would cost billions and take years. Carney understood that leverage perfectly. He did not need to cut off oil today. He only had to demonstrate that Canada could redirect it tomorrow. The market absorbed that message in real time. U.S. refinery stocks fell across the board. Marathon Petroleum dropped sharply. Valero slid hard. Phillips 66 followed. Analysts at Goldman Sachs rushed out an emergency note to clients with a two-word headline, supply risk. On Wall Street, that translates to serious trouble. Then Carney delivered announcement number 3, and this one blindsided everyone. Canada unveiled a joint digital infrastructure and artificial intelligence pact with the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Australia. Shared data standards, shared AI safety frameworks, mutual recognition of digital intellectual property, and written directly into the agreement was a clause excluding the United States. 5 major Western economies had formed a technology alliance without America. This had never happened. Since 1945, the United States sat at the center of every major Western economic and technological framework. In one morning, Carney removed it from the room. The stakes here are enormous because the next industrial revolution runs on data and AI, and whoever sets the standards controls the future. With these economies aligned, American tech companies now face dual regulatory systems, higher compliance costs, and shrinking access abroad. Silicon Valley lobbyists flooded Capitol Hill by noon. Markets reacted again. The NASDAQ dropped 550 points, its worst single-day decline in 14 months. Meta, Google, Microsoft all took heavy hits, not because their products suddenly failed, but because investors realized American tech dominance is not guaranteed. Inside the White House, chaos replaced confidence. Economic advisors split into 2 camps. One side pushed for escalation, broader tariffs, sanctions on Canadian banks, asset freezes, full economic warfare. The other warned this had already crossed into catastrophe territory and urged immediate de-escalation before the losses hardened into permanent damage. Trump ignored both. He defaulted to instinct. Never retreat, never apologize, attack harder. Meanwhile, the world watched and quietly adjusted. Carney's strategy deserves attention because it reveals a deeper shift in how power works. In the modern economy, strength no longer comes from size alone. It comes from connectivity. The United States remains the largest economy, but that matters far less when other nations build roots around it. Carney was not trying to defeat America. He was making it optional. That approach is far more dangerous to long-term influence than any tariff. Trump operates in transactions, Carney operates in networks. When one node in a network applies pressure, the others reorganize, forming new pathways that do not disappear once the pressure eases. Every agreement Carney signed this week weakens U.S. economic centrality, not individually, but collectively, because together they prove the American market is no longer the only gateway to prosperity. Once that belief takes hold globally, decades of leverage evaporate. This is not a negotiation, it is a restructuring. And the consequences are already landing at street level. In Michigan, the auto industry depends on parts that cross the Canadian border multiple times before a vehicle rolls off the line. That supply chain now faces uncertainty. Every day this drags on, manufacturers explore alternatives in Mexico and overseas. Once those relationships solidify, those jobs do not return. In Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota, Canadian energy helps keep heating costs stable and factories competitive. If that flow shifts toward the Pacific, even partially, Americans will compete with Japan and South Korea for the same barrels of oil. Prices rise, margins shrink. In tech, companies now face regulatory fragmentation that could erase profits for mid-sized firms and force giants to redesign operations for separate systems. Anyone with a retirement account can already see the impact. The volatility unfolding is not a temporary spike. It is a repricing of American economic leadership that has been assumed for 30 years. Beyond dollars and data, something more profound is happening. The moral authority of the United States